Welcome to the Barakat Trust podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Barakat Trust, where we invite scholars, practitioners, and experts to discuss the most important ideas that concern the cultural and artistic heritage of the Islamic world. I'm Thomas Adkins, Communications Coordinator at the Barakat Trust, and today I'm with Mikael Muehlbauer, lecturer in the discipline of art history and archaeology at Columbia University. Thanks for speaking with us today, Mikael.
No, it's great to be here.
So in our last episode, we explored the role of Armenian architects in the Ottoman East. And today's conversation with Mikael is going to see us take a journey significantly further south to Ethiopia, where we will be tracking a deceivingly simple piece of stone through time. It may not sound like the most exciting history, but I can guarantee that Mikael will be able to make an intriguing story out of it. So this episode is part of the Barakat Trust Peripheries podcast series, where we're seeking to bring new ideas and places that are normally considered marginal to the heritage of the Islamic world into the broader conversation. And through these discussions, we'll show that these topics are in fact not peripheral, but central to how we understand and think about the Islamic world. And so today I'm delighted to welcome Mikael to speak about Ethiopia. Mikael is a specialist in the architecture of medieval Ethiopia and Egypt, with a broad interest in interfaith exchanges and historical memory. He received his PhD from Columbia University and is the author of the 2023 book, Bastions of the Cross, Medieval Rock-Cut Cruciform Churches of Tigray, Ethiopia, as well as an upcoming book, Inventing Late Antiquity in Fatimid Egypt. As well as having held residential fellowships in Egypt, Italy, France, and Tunisia, Mikael works regularly in Ethiopia as a consulting specialist in architecture and Islamic material culture for the Franco-Ethiopian missions Sustainable Lalibela, as well as the Mariam Nazrat excavations. Anyway, Mikael, that's enough of me talking. Let's get back to the stone. Let's start with a very simple question. Why have you written so much about one stone? Why is it important to you, and why should it be important for us?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So Islam is often written out of the history of medieval Ethiopia. Medieval Ethiopia is often considered to be sort of like an island of Christianity, an island of very ancient Christianity in Ethiopia. Muslims in Ethiopia remain marginalized today, sort of in the political conversation. And this stone is really evidence of the earliest sort of Islamic political activity in the region. This is like sort of considered to be the heartlands of Christian civilization in Ethiopia. And this stone is the only remains of sort of Islamic state building in the Christian heartlands.
So in many ways, disrupting modern narratives about Ethiopia as a Christian island in an Islamic region.
Exactly. So this stone, in fact, it was maintained in a church, and it also tells us very, very interesting ancient exchanges between Islam and Christianity in the medieval period.
And so could you draw for us the context, just the historical context of the medieval period? What are the main dynasties, and maybe also some of the architectural or artistic trends in very broad terms that were going on at this time?
Yeah, so it's important to sort of highlight what's going on in Ethiopia at this time. So Ethiopia in this period, this is the Middle Ages. I feel comfortable, again, calling it the Middle Ages because it follows roughly the parameters of the Mediterranean and the Islamic world at this time. But Ethiopia in antiquity, it was home to what is called the Aksumite Empire. It occupied the northern part of Ethiopia as well as Eritrea, periodically Arabia, which also makes it very, very important for sort of the foundations of Islam. But Ethiopia, it was the second country in the world to actually make Christianity its dynastic religion. Again, it was following the Emperor Constantine, but Constantine, he was personally a Christian. The Roman Empire didn't become Christian until 395. So Ethiopia is very, very old, this very, very old Christian state Aksum. But Aksum, it collapses around the year 700 for reasons that are debated. If you read older literature, they'll say that it was the Islamic conquest that was decidedly not the factor. Islam was maybe the only thing keeping the state kind of alive as a merchant in the very early period, but that's another story. So Ethiopia, after the collapse of Aksum, we don't have much material evidence. We don't have much written evidence for what they're doing. We have monuments, but these monuments are undated. And in fact, this was the subject of my 2023 book, but three churches, including the Church of Wukocherkos, which is where the Arabic inscribed stone fragment came from, these are from sort of this 11th century period of sort of political revival of a Christian state, political revival that accompanied Islamic expansion in the region.
And can I ask, have you visited these churches? And could you describe what they're like for someone who hasn't visited?
Yeah, so I had the very good fortune of being able to spend a long time in these churches. I've been going to Ethiopia regularly since 2016, so that's a while now. Yeah, and I had the great experience of being able to visit these churches, and really, you know, Ethiopian churches, they tend to be scattered. They are not easily dated, and they are scattered usually in places that nowadays seem pretty remote. The key with these churches, so Wukocherkos in particular, where the stone fragment was found, this is a church that's actually sort of the most urban ancient church. And that seems to be the case even when it was founded. So it seems to have been a sort of major urban church, which again takes us back to the fragment in that, we don't have any archaeology, but it's quite possible that this was a major, like maybe Fatimid sort of puppet capital of some sort of puppet state of the Fatimids, and that this was the Friday Mosque.
And so, I mean, what's clear is even before we're in the Fatimid period of roughly the late 10th century into the 12th century, we have a huge amount of interconnection, not just trade and material culture, but also political, between Ethiopia and the Arabian Peninsula, as you mentioned. Which brings us to the churches, which specifically brings us to the stone fragment. I actually wanted to read a very short section that you wrote, I thought very beautifully, about this piece of stone. And so I wanted to read it out just to give our listeners an idea of what this piece of stone looks like, how to imagine this piece of stone, and then we can elaborate a bit more on its importance. So, Michael, you wrote, until 2010, a curious sandstone block laid against a wall in the anteroom greeted those who entered the monastery church of St. Cyricus in Tigray, Ethiopia. The stone was clearly a fragment and was presented as if it were just another liturgical vessel in the church. Roughly rectangular and carved in deep relief, one side was well dressed and had a perfect rectilinear border strip, while the other end was jagged and diagonal, and the top edge was chipped and irregular. Most of the stone's surface was inscribed in Kufic, underscored by an interlaced scroll containing only 2 words and a letter fragment. Now, maybe from this section that you wrote, we could begin with the Kufic. This could be a link that you can explain that will contextualize the rest of this stone. What is Kufic?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it's really the style of the epigraphic program that tells us anything, because again, it contains 2 words and a letter fragment, and those 2 words don't really tell us too much. It is al-mulk, or Aleph, Lam, Mim, Lam, Kaf, which again, the triconsonantal root, it could be many different words, generally words associated with authority, but a lot of words. So again, it only contains these 2 words. So we really, really need to rely on the style of the letter forms. So the letter forms are in Kufic. This is a very, very sort of angular style of the early Arabic epigraphy. It is not cursive. It's before sort of the development of cursive. And it sort of implies, scholars have made the case that it implies that that the inscriptions weren't really meant to be read as a text. It was almost like a visual reference in a way. And the letters are very, very angular. They're carved in very deep relief. They're big. And they have on the ends of the letters, they have these flared ends. Sometimes they're called like crow's feet. It shows that it's meant to be a fancy, it's almost meant to be seen as a sort of just decoration, even though it's legible as a script. And what really relates it to what's happening politically in Egypt is because the Aleph and Lam, the two stems of the letters, they are intertwined with each other in a very characteristic way. And if we think about the history of these types of very, very fancy, monumental, stylized inscriptions, this relates it directly to the 11th century.
In 11th century in general.
11th century Fatimids, yeah.
Okay.
So the reign of Badr al-Jamali, who was, we're talking about a caliphate here, but this is a period, and Badr al-Jamali is an interesting figure. Actually, if we're thinking about the broader history, he was actually maybe a Christian, not so secretly a Christian, but he was sort of the quasi-caliph. He was the strong man, and even though the Fatimid caliphs had the theological and theoretically political power, he was like the strong man. He was the general. And sometimes he's considered behind the Fatimid Renaissance of the 11th century.
And for context, he is also the one who is thought to have built some of the important gates of Cairo when it was a walled city of the northern gates, Bab al-Nasr and Bab al-Futuh. But it's interesting that you can spot these similarities as far south as Ethiopia. I mean, how was Egypt and Ethiopia connected at this point? What was the interlinkage that connected these two places?
Yeah, so this is a great point. So we need to sort of take a little bit of a step back here to talk about who's who in this situation. So Egypt at this time is under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, which is a Ismaili Shiite dynasty. This is very distinctive because essentially they consider authority, both religious and political, that it needs to be from the family of the Prophet Muhammad. And they begin in North Africa. They invade Egypt, I believe 969 is when they invade Egypt. And they are, of course, responsible for founding the main city of Cairo. Basically, it's in the late 10th and 11th century. They are the Islamic power par excellence. But at the end of the 11th century, the Fatimids, especially in the Mediterranean, which sort of were their domain, things aren't going so well. You have the Crusaders in the Levant, Syria, Palestine, and then you have in the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia, you have the Seljuk Turks arriving. And what happens here is that the Fatimids they lose their political power in the Mediterranean. They lose their trade power in the Mediterranean. And what we see here, this is under the reign of Badr al-Jamali. He's sort of responsible for this Fatimid Renaissance. Again, it's sort of a literal Renaissance because this kind of pseudo-Roman walls in Cairo that he builds. You know, the walls were mud brick, and he knocks them down and he erects these giant stone gates. But in any case, part of his political maneuvering is that essentially he focuses the Fatimid activities, Fatimid political as well as religious activities. The Fatimids, they maintained a religious missionary network called Dawa. And essentially he refocuses this completely towards the Red Sea. And the Red Sea, of course, is the corridor to India, where you get all the beautiful silks and spices. And with bringing it back to Ethiopia, we're in this Dark Ages period. We don't know anything who or what is going on, but theoretically, the whatever state is active there is Christian, and particularly they are Christian under the Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt. And this is something that we know from the history of the Patriarchs of Alexandria. It's a Arabic Christian chronicle from the 1300s, is that essentially Badr al-Jamali uses the leverage of Egyptian Christians as sort of subject in Egypt. He uses this leverage to enforce trade and sort of dawah activities in Ethiopia. Taking this into broader consideration, Ethiopia is the highlands facing the Red Sea. It's right across the sea from Mecca and Medina. It's very close to Yemen. All these places are stopping grounds and sort of trade entrepôts in their own right with India. And he builds 4 mosques. He demands that whoever is in charge in Ethiopia allows the Fatimids to build 4 mosques in Ethiopia. And again, I'm quite sure that this is where our fragment comes from.
Oh, so you think that this stone is from one of these mosques and was part of the inscription program of it?
I'm almost positive because,
Okay.
again, this is Kufic. This is very, very fancy Kufic. Stylistically, it seems to be from the reign of Badr al-Jamali. Just to give you a sense, this stone is about 30 centimeters wide, and it's just an architectural fragment. 30 centimeters wide. So again, this is a major, major investment. I think that not only was this a royal mosque, but this was probably a Friday mosque, because we know, at least from the Christian side, the stone ends up in a church, that this was a place of major habitation, at least for the Christian state. So could have maybe been like a Fatimid capital or something.
So, I mean, the political linkages are clear and you've just spelled them out beautifully. What about the material culture? I mean, how does that fit into this story of movement up and down the Red Sea from Ethiopia, Yemen, Al-Hijaz into Egypt and onwards? Something you talk about quite a lot is the textiles and the stylistic comparisons that you're able to make through them. How do the textiles fit into this story? And what do these textiles look like? I mean, could you describe them for me to begin with?
Yeah, so this is one of these great things. It gets back to the point about what the Fatimids were doing in this region in the first place. Again, nowadays we get textiles, they lack the qualities that they used to have. Nowadays, we have textile mills. You can get T-shirts for 50 cents or whatever, made in Southeast Asia under bad circumstances. Back at this time, textiles were the luxury commodity. We can say for certain that they were the most expensive product. And not only were textiles the most expensive product, but textiles that were very exotic. So this is one of these things that in Cairo, we have this trove of documents called the Geniza documents. These were documents by members of the Jewish community, but primarily, but including others. But these are essentially just documents, and a lot of them talk about trade. And something that comes up again and again are cotton textiles from India. In this case, the textual record is skewed to Egypt, but the material record is also skewed to Egypt because almost all of these textiles came from it has a kind of funny name. It's called like the Fustat trash heap. Allegedly because there was a big trash heap of these silk and cotton scraps in Fustat that were excavated. This is a myth.
I was going to say that the beauty of a dry climate and the gifts that it has stored for historians and our historians.
No, exactly, but that's the thing. These were mummy tapes, not pharaonic mummy tapes,
okay.
but the Fatimid just bodies. So if Fustat, there's this mythical trash heap that's convenient. But in any case, these little scraps have ended up in museums. And what I've been able to see is that what the Fatimids, silks and cottons, these were the major commodities that were used in Cairo. How did they get from India to Egypt? Ethiopia, as in antiquity, it was sort of the middleman. Ethiopia and Yemen, which of course were together at this time. With textiles, with this sort of key economic primacy, they also had a religious primacy in
Hmm.
terms of veils and screens in churches and mosques. And for this epigraphy, for example, we can see the epigraphy of the stone. The letter forms can be connected to tiraz. That's the sort of the most luxurious textile product of the Fatimids. These inscribed textiles inscribed with auspicious statements or statements naming the reigning caliph. But then also textiles produced in a Southeast Asian manner, the
Hmm.
method of ikat, but sourced from Yemen. So again,
Okay.
all of these sort of Red Sea maritime signifiers, and we
Mm.
can see those in the epigraphy and layout of that
I mean,
inscription.
some incredibly complex connections that you've just pointed to. I feel like we're talking about the Fatimids and this connection with Ethiopia, and it's all quite beautiful, and there's a lot of movement, and there's a lot of money and a lot of products moving about. But then clearly, for this stone to survive, something has gone wrong. We know that the Fatimids didn't go out with a bang; they more went out with a very slow, gradual groan, and then disappeared as the Ayyubids overtook in Egypt. What did this mean for Ethiopia, the end of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt? And for our stone in particular, what happened to the stone and how has it ended up in a church?
So this is one of these great things, and or I mean, great in that it's almost like some sort of like mythical tragedy or something. The fates of Ethiopia, Christian Ethiopia, and the Fatimids,
Mm.
because essentially the Church of Wukrocherkos and this stone they grow up together. I think probably they are two sides of the same coin. It was probably Friday Mosque and church together. And if we talk about the political history of Ethiopia, the way that Ethiopia sort of emerges from this dark age is through trading with the Fatimids. Again, Ethiopians as middlemen in this sort of broader Red Sea scheme. And what happens is that the Fatimids they enforce the building of these four mosques. They end up trading in all sorts of exotic products, and they actually set up a community. And we know a little bit something about at least what happened to the members of this community because we have a graveyard with dated gravestones and also very, very interesting for our purposes, Nizba, essentially sort of surnames or origin markers. So we actually know where the traders came from. And what happens is that it directly maps onto essentially the reign of Badr al-Jamali. Most of the gravestones are from the late 11th century. That seems to have been the high watermark. Four mosques were built,
Hmm.
including this very, very substantial mosque, of which only this one fragment survives. And then essentially they stopped burying people around 1150, more or less.
Right.
And these are just gravestones. Maybe they shifted position, maybe they shifted place, but we know we begin to have Christian documentation in this period. And we have what is one of the first known named Ethiopian kings after antiquity. We have in a inscription dedicating grounds for a new church right on the border with Eritrea. We have an inscription of a man named Tanta Wedem, who was a Ethiopian emperor. And in order to provide church lands, he actually says that he forces all settled Muslims to leave, and then he confiscates all their livestock. So the end of this cemetery, as well as this note, seem to indicate that Ethiopia was almost a Prometheus. They were enriched with the Fatimids, they were reconnected with the church in Egypt, and then what do? They end up kicking out their
Mm.
state that they were formerly aligned with.
And I mean, it's noticeable that these shifts are taking place as Fatimid power is withdrawing. You said those final gravestones were 1150s, and 20 years later or so, the Fatimids finally took their last breath. So we now are in the late 12th century, and we have the Fatimids gone, and a growing Christian polity in Ethiopia. And you're thinking that the stone fragment ended up in a church. I mean, I think we can easily today look at fragments like this with Arabic script and what we've discussed so far, clearly an Islamic epigraphic program, and think, oh, this is very communitarian or sectarian. But how do you think in the medieval period, 12th, 13th century onwards, Christians in a church would have perceived a stone fragment like this with Arabic on it?
Yeah, so what happens to the fragment, where it comes from, we need to sort of backtrack to because all we have is a tiny little fragment. How do we know it even came from a mosque? It doesn't really tell us too much. So the way we know that, or the way I know that it came from a mosque, is that there was a British, what is called the punitive expedition. Essentially, in the late 19th century, some missionaries get ransomed in Ethiopia, and the British essentially launch a mission to depose the emperor and replace him with a more friendly emperor. Sort of colonial adventurism. But in any case, they bring along war correspondents who are recording this country that hasn't really been visited by many Europeans. And there is this war correspondent, William Simpson, who visits the Church of Wukur Cherkos, which at that time was called Dongolo, and he basically surveys the whole church, and he sees being used as a sanctuary screen. This is the wall essentially enclosing the high altar. He finds a arch, not only an arch, but what we call a keel arch or a four-center pointed arch. This is Fatimid 100%. And we can see from his lithograph that actually the stone was once part of it. And in fact, he records part of the inscription, and he records that it reads as Al-Mulk, which again, we don't know where he recorded it on the arch, but it means that it was essentially repeated across all of the arch haunches. So it's fascinating that sort of the clue that it was part of a mosque. I think that it's a mihrab hood, given because it has the this very, very elaborate epigraphy, and it was only in Cairo where you could sort of afford to have epigraphy all over a mosque surface, but that's another story. And it was actually the entire mihrab hood was essentially spoliated and being used as a sanctuary screen for the high altar. So Ethiopian Christians, they understood it as being a something worthwhile, something worth saving. And I don't think that they thought it was explicitly Islamic when they put it there, because when it was installed there, this, based on the liturgical history of the church, that type of screen, that's what we would call like a haikal screen in Egypt. This is like a wall-like screen. This is a Mamluk development. So in fact, when this arch is spoliated, even though it's from the 11th century, it is only until the 14th or 15th centuries, accompanying a fire that happens in the church. It destroys the original wooden furnishings, that Christians then choose to take this big piece of exogenous Fatimid material and use it as a screen for the most luxurious part of the church. When they saw the Arabic, they weren't seeing Islam. They were seeing the mother church in Egypt, because again, at this time, archbishops are coming down from Egypt. They are bringing things. They are bringing metalwork from Egypt. They are bringing Copto-Arabic documents, liturgical documents. So they would have seen Arabic as just a liturgical language of the mother church. It's not even clear that they knew where this fragment came from. It was very many hundred years since they had seen it in its original location in a mosque.
And so, I mean, that just shows how different things have become today in terms of how scripts and decoration is perceived by contemporary audiences. As we sort of reach the end of our story, today in Ethiopia, how is this piece of stone perceived, if it's even known about, or what this stone represents? A past of integration up the Red Sea with traders of different backgrounds, different religions. How is this story perceived today?
So getting back to the stone, it was used as this arch. This arch was recorded in 1868. But all we have is this fragment. We don't have the rest of the arch. And photo documentation from the 1960s until essentially the year 2000, it shows that the arch, the full arch had come apart, but the local church had actually reconstructed this four-centered arch. This is not an Ethiopian decorative device. This is a Fatimid, sensibly Islamic decorative device, that they were reconstructing that fragment in a four-centered arch to screen the sanctuary.
Hmm.
And then when that was dismantled for unknown reasons, they kept the fragment not because it symbolized anything, but because it was just part of the old screen. And again, people save old liturgical equipment
Yeah.
for posterity. So in its church context, it was sort of entirely devoid of any Islamic context. And one of these very, very interesting phenomena is that actually the stone was first published about over 2 decades ago in a book. It's the best textbook on geology on Ethiopia.
Geology.
Geology, yeah, because the stone, it's made of a local
Okay, yes.
sandstone. But in any case, that author, he photographs it to show that it's a piece of local sandstone, and he says it is carved with an ancient Aksumite or Christian Ethiopian inscription. So in fact, it was found in a church, and in the context of Ethiopia, even Ethiopian academia, it was just considered to be a piece of Christian cultural heritage, which
Right.
again, there's a sort of sad irony to this when you take into account the history of Islam in Ethiopia, because Islam and even now relations with Egypt in terms of historical relations with the church,
Yes.
it couldn't be worse. It couldn't be worse at the time. Muslims in Ethiopia now, they remain somewhat marginalized. They remain marginalized in history, and Islam is connected to several traumatic moments in
Mm.
the historical memory there, when in fact the medieval story is actually much more nuanced.
Yeah. As you have shown beautifully today, Michael, thank you for sharing this. I have one sort of final question, maybe slightly hypothetical. We know that the stone has gone. No one really knows what's happened to it now. There is a final photo, I believe, from 2010, fairly recently. Where do you think it is, and will you ever be able to see it? Will anyone be able to ever see it again if they find it?
So this is one of these funny things. I've been to Wukro Cherkos many, many times. I've spent a lot of time there. I've never actually, for all the time that I've spent examining the stone, I've never seen it. And
Really?
I've never even had the chance to see it because in 2010, this is, again, third-hand oral history that I'm getting. But apparently, a elderly tourist had visited the church, and he kind of wanted to lift up the stone. Maybe he wanted to see the back, maybe he wanted to look closer at it, but it was too heavy for him and he dropped it. And again,
Hmm.
it's a major embarrassment for the church because it's sort of mismanaging
Yeah.
cultural heritage. But for a while, the stone was broken and it was maintained in storage in the back of the church. And nowadays, it's nowhere to be seen. I was told that it was with the cultural heritage authorities in um, the region of Tigray, but of course I was working with them and no one had ever heard of it.
Yeah.
So again, I hope that it will be back. And it's also interesting because what we find in other places in Ethiopia, old liturgical equipment, old wood screens, etc.,
Yeah.
sometimes they end up being restored and replaced. And I wonder, had that stone never been broken, it was waiting there in storage. I wonder if they actually intended to make a whole new screen for it at a later date.
Well, one day we'll find out, maybe. I mean, even if we've not found the stone and you haven't been able to find it for us, you have found what I think is a fascinating story of interconnection of material culture, architecture, political hegemony. And I thank you for taking the time to speak to us about that, explain everything so beautifully. And Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Barakat Trust podcast.